The lights above operating room 4 flickered violently as 4 surgeons fought to keep a man's heart beating. Crimson soaked through layers of gauze faster than the nurses could replace them. Monitors screamed in protest, their erratic rhythm filling the corridor outside, where dozens of men in identical black suits stood frozen, afraid to breathe. A whisper moved through the hallway like smoke under a locked door. It's him, the boss of the Seoul Syndicate. Yi-jun. Nobody dared speak louder. Even half-conscious and torn open on a steel table, his name carried enough weight to silence an entire wing of Severance Hospital. Outside, his father stood motionless, hands clasped behind his back, watching through reinforced glass as machines fought a war his son's body was losing. 11 minutes. That's how long his heart stopped. The lead surgeon would later admit, in hushed tones to colleagues who refused to repeat it, that nothing in medical literature explained how a man flatlined for that long, opened his eyes again. But he did. 3 weeks crawled by in merciless silence. The man once feared across the entire peninsula now sat motionless in a wheelchair position beside a window on the 11th floor, staring at a city that no longer belonged to him. His legs hadn't moved since the night of the accident. Doctors spoke of nerve damage, of slow recovery, of hope. He didn't respond to any of it. He simply stared. No flinch, no tremor. No sound escaped him, not even when nurses changed the dressing on wounds that should have ended his life twice over. The silence radiating from him unsettled even the most seasoned staff, men who had handled gunshot victims, stabbing wounds, men whose hands didn't shake until they entered his room. Then the door opened. His father walked in. No embrace, no relief, no words of comfort for the son who had clawed his way back from death's threshold. Instead, he stood behind the wheelchair, gazing out at the same skyline his son refused to look away from, and delivered 8 words that would shatter something far deeper than bone. Your younger brother will run the organization now. Silence swallowed the room whole. The machines kept beeping. The city kept moving. But something inside Yi-jun went still in a way the accident never managed. He hadn't lost the use of his legs that night. He'd lost everything that made him who he was. And nobody in that sterile, fluorescent-lit room understood that the real story, the one that would unravel hearts and detonate an empire, hadn't even begun. If this is your first time here, welcome. Subscribe before you forget. Drop a comment telling me which city you're watching this from tonight, and let's sink into this one together, because by the end you're going to need someone to talk to about it. Dukwon left the room without waiting for a reaction. He had given his verdict the way he gave every order inside the organization, flatly, finally, with no room for negotiation. Yi-jun remained by the window long after the door clicked shut. His reflection ghosted faintly over the skyline he once owned, and for the first time in his adult life, he understood what it meant to be irrelevant. He stopped eating. Trays arrived untouched and left untouched, sometimes overturned, sometimes flung across the room with enough force to crack tile. He stopped speaking to the physical therapist assigned to coax movement back into limbs that refused to cooperate. He fired 3 nurses in a single week, not through cruelty exactly, but through an emptiness so total that human warmth simply could not survive near him. His mother, Yi-jun, visited once and left in tears within minutes. His wife stopped coming altogether after the 2nd week, citing exhaustion, though the staff whispered it was something closer to disgust. Flowers sent by distant relatives wilted in unopened boxes by the door. Equipment meant to monitor his recovery sat broken in a corner, smashed during one of his rages. The hospital administration debated discharging him entirely. No nurse on staff would agree to a 4th rotation. Word had spread through every department like infection. It wasn't merely cruelty that made him impossible. It was the particular, suffocating grief of a man who had spent 36 years believing himself indestructible, only to discover that an empire built on fear evaporates the instant the man enforcing that fear can no longer stand on his own 2 feet. Visitors who arrived hoping to offer condolences left instead with their dignity stripped bare, victims of a tongue sharpened by humiliation he refused to name aloud. A senior physician attempted, on the 15th day, to explain the long-term trajectory of his recovery using careful, measured optimism. Yi-jun overturned the rolling tray beside his bed before the man finished his second sentence, sending a ceramic water pitcher exploding against the far wall. The physician didn't return. Administrators convened an emergency meeting to discuss transferring him to a private facility better equipped to handle, as one nervous director phrased it, patients exhibiting volatile behavioral patterns. Dukwon vetoed the suggestion with a single phone call that ended careers within the hour. Even the most loyal members of his inner circle began quietly distancing themselves, visiting less frequently, finding reasons their schedules no longer permitted the hospital detour they once made without question. Power, Yi-jun learned in those bitter weeks, had always been the only language his world understood, and a man confined to a wheelchair simply no longer spoke it fluently enough to command a room. Then she walked in. She didn't introduce herself with nervous formality the way the others had. She simply set her bag down, glanced at the wreckage of monitoring equipment scattered across the floor, and asked, without a trace of fear in her voice, whether he intended to throw the next one at her directly or give her a moment's warning first. He didn't answer. She smiled anyway, the kind of smile that wasn't trying to win anything, and got to work. Her name was KC. Across the city, in offices that had once belonged exclusively to Yi-jun, his younger brother Dong was settling into an authority he had never asked for and didn't entirely trust himself to wield. Dong visited the hospital twice during those early weeks, standing awkwardly at the foot of his older brother's bed, searching for words that might bridge a silence neither of them knew how to cross. Yi-jun refused to look at him either time. Word reached the nurse's station within the hour. Everyone warned her. They told her about the broken equipment, the fired staff, the silence that swallowed grown men whole. She listened politely, nodded once, and said only, "I'll still do my job," before walking back into a room that had become a graveyard for compassion. Nobody understood, not yet, why a woman with no apparent connection to Seoul's underworld would walk so willingly into the orbit of its most feared family. That question would not be answered for another 40 minutes of story. The first week with KCE unfolded with the patience of a tide reshaping stone. She didn't attempt conversation he wasn't ready for. She changed his bandages with practiced, gentle hands while he stared past her shoulder at nothing. She brought meals and left them within reach without comment. And when he ignored them, she removed the trays without judgment and returned the next day with something different. He insulted her twice during that first week, words sharp enough to have sent the previous nurses sprinting toward the elevator in tears. KC simply absorbed them, the way stone absorbs rain, unmoved, unchanged, present. He threw a bottle of medication across the room on the 9th day. She watched it shatter, said nothing, and quietly retrieved a replacement from the supply cart without breaking stride in whatever sentence she'd been speaking before the interruption. She read to him sometimes, novels mostly, stories about people who lost everything and found some fragment of themselves again in unexpected places. He never acknowledged listening, yet his eyes would occasionally drift from the window toward her hands as she turned each page. Something imperceptible was shifting beneath the surface, the way a glacier moves without ever appearing to move at all. Each morning followed the same quiet choreography. She arrived precisely at 7, greeted him whether or not he acknowledged her presence, and proceeded through her duties with a calm thoroughness that never once asked anything of him in return. She didn't demand gratitude. She didn't demand conversation. She simply existed beside him, steady and unhurried, like a tide that arrives regardless of whether anyone watches it come in. On the 4th day, she began narrating small fragments of her own life while she worked, never expecting a response, filling the silence with stories about a childhood spent between 2 countries, about a grandmother who taught her remedies long before she ever earned a medical license, about the particular stubbornness of certain plants that refused to grow no matter how carefully you tended them. He never commented, but he listened, his eyes occasionally tracking toward her, even when his expression betrayed nothing. A junior doctor once asked her, in the privacy of the supply closet, why she bothered subjecting herself to a patient who treated everyone around him like furniture. Casey considered the question for a long moment before answering that some wounds couldn't be reached through medicine alone, that sometimes the only available treatment was simply refusing to disappear. By the 7th day, he had stopped throwing things in her presence, though he still occasionally hurled insults sharp enough to draw blood from anyone less resolute. She absorbed each one without comment, continued whatever task occupied her hands, and returned the following morning as though nothing had been said at all. A veteran nurse who had worked the surgical ward for over a decade and who had witnessed every manner of human suffering imaginable pulled Casey aside one evening to ask what exactly kept her returning to a room that had broken every colleague before her. Casey considered the question with the same unhurried patience she brought to everything else, finally answering that broken men weren't dangerous because they were cruel. They were dangerous because nobody had ever stayed long enough to watch them stop being afraid. The older nurse studied her for a long moment afterward, unable to shake the feeling that the answer, however gentle it sounded, concealed something far more complicated underneath. On the 11th day, as she gathered her belongings to leave for the evening, a single word escaped him, rough from disuse, barely audible. "Stay." Casey froze near the doorway. It was the first word he had willingly offered another human being in 19 days. She turned back slowly, set her bag down again without a word, and sat in the chair beside his bed until the night nurse arrived for the shift change. Neither of them spoke again that evening, but something had cracked open between them, something neither was prepared to name. His wife noticed before anyone else did. Word of the strange tenderness developing inside that hospital room eventually reached deeper into the organization than anyone intended. Lieutenants who had spent years fearing Yi Jun's temper now exchanged uneasy glances whenever his name came up in conversation, uncertain whether the rumors of a softened boss represented opportunity or catastrophe for an empire that had always run on fear. Siyu had built her entire identity around the privileges of her marriage, the chauffeured cars, the penthouse overlooking the Han River, the deference strangers offered the moment they learned her surname. She visited the hospital infrequently, but frequently enough to register the shift in her husband's demeanor, the way his attention now tracked a nurse's movements across a room instead of staring blankly through her. She confronted Casey in the hallway outside his room, voice low and venomous, accusing her of manipulation, of gold digging, of things far uglier that needn't be repeated here. Casey absorbed every word without flinching, apologized for any misunderstanding, and never once raised her voice in defense. Siyu mistook the silence for weakness. She began making calls that same evening. Within days, hospital security staff found themselves suddenly more attentive to Casey's movements. Rumors circulated through the staff break room, whispers about missing supplies, about inappropriate conduct, about things that had never actually happened but somehow gained traction regardless. Money changes opinions quickly in places where salaries barely cover rent, and Siyu understood this better than most. Casey noticed the shifting glances, the sudden coldness from colleagues who had been friendly only days before. She said nothing. She kept showing up. She kept doing her job with the same unshakable calm that had carried her through every insult and every thrown object during those first difficult weeks. Siyu escalated further during a confrontation that occurred late one evening in the hospital's parking structure, cornering Casey between two vehicles where no security cameras could capture what was said. She threatened, in language stripped of any pretense toward civility, that she possessed both the resources and the patience to destroy a woman's career, reputation, and quiet little life if that woman didn't remove herself from her husband's recovery immediately. Siyu had married into this family 8 years earlier, believing love had nothing to do with the arrangement, that proximity to power was its own sufficient reward. She had endured countless humiliations over the years, affairs she pretended not to notice, business dinners where men spoke over her as though she were furniture, and she had built her entire sense of self around the unshakable certainty that whatever else changed, Her husband would always, eventually, need her. Watching that certainty dissolve in front of a nurse who hadn't even bothered fighting for him terrified her more than she would ever admit aloud. Casey listened to the entire threat without interruption. When Siyu finally finished, breathless with her own fury, Casey simply nodded once and said she understood completely, before walking calmly back toward the staff entrance as though she'd merely been informed of the schedule change. That composure, that infuriating refusal to crumble, only intensified CUS' obsession. She began arriving at the hospital unannounced, watching from hallways, documenting every interaction between her husband and his nurse with a photographer she'd hired through connections she preferred nobody question too closely. She hired a private investigator as well, convinced there had to be some hidden scandal buried in KC's past that would justify the loathing she felt and provide ammunition for whatever campaign she eventually waged. The investigator returned weeks later with a file disappointingly thin, a quiet upbringing, an unremarkable nursing career, no criminal record, no obvious motive beyond apparent professional diligence. CU burned the file in frustration, never once questioning why a background check this thorough had somehow failed to uncover a single mention of a sister who had died under circumstances connected to her own husband's organization. The omission wasn't an oversight. It had been engineered years in advance, records altered, names changed, an entire fabricated history constructed with the same patience that defined everything else KC had built toward this moment. The audience watching this unfold from the outside would have sworn, with absolute certainty, that they understood exactly who the villain of this story was. They would have been catastrophically wrong. If you're still here, go ahead and like this video right now. It genuinely helps the channel more than you'd think. And trust me, you're going to want to be subscribed before we reach what happens around the 40-minute mark, because what's coming will completely rearrange everything you think you know about these two people. CUS campaign against KC escalated faster than anyone anticipated. She demanded a divorce, not because she wanted freedom, but because she expected her husband to beg her to stay, to choose the marriage over whatever fragile thing was growing between himself and his nurse. It was a calculated gamble, the kind of move a woman makes when she has never once lost a confrontation in her life. Yi-jun signed the papers without reading a single clause. He didn't argue. He didn't negotiate. He simply signed, pushed the documents back across the table with his good hand, and returned his attention to the window as though the conversation had cost him nothing at all. CUS humiliation curdled into something far more dangerous than jealousy. She spent the following days perfecting her retaliation with the meticulous patience of someone who had built her entire adult life around the art of getting precisely what she wanted. Old friendships within the hospital administration, cultivated over years of charitable donations and carefully timed favors, suddenly proved invaluable. A junior security officer indebted to her family agreed, for a sum neither of them ever spoke of again, to misplace certain footage during a specific window of time. Within a week, missing narcotics were reported from the hospital's secure storage. Security footage covering the relevant hours had inexplicably corrupted itself. An anonymous tip led investigators directly to KC's locker, where a quantity of missing medication had somehow relocated itself overnight. She was terminated within 48 hours, no formal hearing, no opportunity to defend herself against evidence so conveniently assembled that even the hospital's own legal counsel privately questioned its authenticity. KCE accepted her dismissal without protest, packed her belongings, and disappeared from the hospital entirely. CU, meanwhile, discovered that humiliation tasted nothing like the victory she'd anticipated. The divorce settlement left her financially secure but socially diminished, whispered about at the same dinner parties where she had once commanded effortless deference. She moved out of the penthouse overlooking the Han River within a month, unable to bear hallways that still echoed with the sound of marriage that had ended without a single argument. She would spend the following months convinced she had won a war that, in truth, she had never even been allowed to fight, a pawn in a design infinitely larger than her own petty cruelties, though she never once suspected it. Yi-jun descended into a silence darker than anything that preceded it. 3 replacement nurses quit within their first shift alone. Doctors warned Dukwon that his son's refusal to cooperate with treatment was actively endangering whatever progress had been made toward recovery. Yi-jun gave a single instruction to the men still loyal enough to take orders from a man confined to a wheelchair. Find her. It took his organization, an apparatus capable of locating fugitives across 3 continents, nearly 9 days to track down a woman who had seemingly vanished without a trace, which in itself should have raised questions nobody thought to ask. Men accustomed to extracting information from hardened criminals found themselves baffled by the absence of any digital footprint, any financial trail, any of the careless mistakes ordinary people make when attempting to disappear. Every lead dissolved into another dead end. Every informant came back empty-handed, until a single overlooked detail, a distant cousin's address buried within an old employment file, finally cracked the search wide open. None of them paused to wonder how a hospital nurse with no apparent connections to organized crime had managed to evade a search this sophisticated for over a week. They simply considered themselves fortunate to have finally succeeded. They found her in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, a cramped house with secondhand furniture and curtains that didn't quite reach the windowsills. When a convoy of black vehicles rolled down her narrow street, neighbors peered through blinds, certain something terrible was about to happen. Casey opened her door to find Yi-jun seated in his wheelchair on her cracked front step, flanked by men who could have leveled the entire block with a phone call. "I only need treatment," he said. Nothing more. No apology for the men who had ruined her reputation. No acknowledgement of the wife who had destroyed her career. Just 4 simple words that somehow contained an entire confession. "Why come here?" she asked, arms crossed, studying the convoy of vehicles crowding her narrow street. "You have doctors, specialists, people paid handsomely to make you comfortable. None of them are you," he said, and the admission seemed to cost him something he hadn't expected to surrender, a fragment of pride he'd been guarding fiercely since the day his father walked into his hospital room and dismantled his identity in 8 words. "I tried 3 more nurses after you. I made all of them quit within a day. I don't know how to explain it beyond that." She studied him for a long moment, the broken man who had once thrown medication at her, who had once said her name like an insult, who now sat in front of her stripped of every title that had ever protected him. "All right," she said. Neither of them could have predicted what those 4 months would become. The weeks that followed unfolded like something out of a dream neither of them had given themselves permission to have. Casey moved him into a small guest house near her home, away from the suffocating machinery of his family's empire, away from staff who reported his every movement back to people with their own agendas. She introduced him to remedies passed down through generations of her family, herbal compresses, traditional massage techniques applied with careful, deliberate pressure along the muscles of his legs, exercises designed to coax circulation back into limbs the hospital had nearly given up on. They cooked together in her cramped kitchen, her instructing while he fumbled clumsily with vegetables he had never once prepared himself in a life that had always included staff for such tasks. He laughed during one particularly disastrous attempt at slicing radish, an unguarded, genuine sound that startled them both into silence afterward. Evenings stretched long and unhurried in ways neither of them had experienced in years. She taught him the names of constellations visible from her small back porch, corrected his clumsy attempts at folding traditional dumplings, and listened patiently while he, for the first time since the accident, spoke openly about the crushing loneliness of leading an empire that feared him more than it ever loved him. He told her about a childhood spent learning violence before he learned arithmetic, about a father who measured affection in territory controlled rather than tenderness offered, about a younger brother he'd spent years protecting from the very world their family had built. She listened to every word with an attentiveness that felt, to him, like being truly seen for the first time in his entire existence. She taught him breathing exercises meant to calm the nervous system, gentle stretches designed to coax stubborn muscles back into cooperation, and a quiet form of meditation her grandmother once practiced beneath cherry trees long since cut down. He resisted at first, embarrassed by his own clumsiness, but gradually surrendered to her patient instruction the way ice eventually surrenders to spring. Twice a week, she prepared compresses from dried herbs she sourced from a small apothecary across town, steeping them in warm water before applying them along the length of his legs while reciting, almost like incantation, the proper sequence of pressure points her grandmother had taught her decades earlier. The ritual took nearly an hour each session, and he came to anticipate it with an eagerness that embarrassed him slightly, not merely for whatever physical benefit it provided, but for the uninterrupted closeness it guaranteed, her hands moving methodically along muscle and bone, her breath steady and close, the rest of the world reduced temporarily to nothing beyond the small, warm room they occupied together. He asked her once, half joking, whether she'd ever considered abandoning medicine altogether to open a clinic specializing in exactly this kind of patient care. She'd smiled at the question longer than it warranted, something flickering briefly behind her eyes that he mistook, at the time, for simple modesty. Hope crept back into his expression in increments so small that only someone watching closely would have noticed. The hollow stare that had defined him in that hospital room slowly gave way to something warmer, something almost unrecognizable from the man who had once been Seoul's most feared crime lord. He died during an operation gone catastrophically sideways, a casualty of decisions made by men who never once considered the cost to the families left behind. The organization labeled him expendable in a single sentence during a meeting that lasted less than 4 minutes. His wife, pregnant at the time, pleaded for compensation, for acknowledgement, for anything resembling humanity from an empire that had taken everything from her and offered nothing back. Security dragged her from the building when she refused to stop pleading. Days later, unable to carry the weight of her grief alone, she ended her own life. That woman had been KC's sister. She described the day itself with a clarity that suggested she had relived it thousands of times in the years since. The rain that fell sideways against the gates of the organization's headquarters, the security guards who laughed among themselves while her sister begged on her knees, 7 months pregnant, for compensation that would have cost the empire less than the catering bill from a single dinner party. She described carrying her sister's body 2 days later, alone, because every relative who once claimed to love their family had grown too frightened of the syndicate's reach to attend a funeral that might draw unwanted attention. Every fact Yi Jun thought he understood about the woman in front of him crumbled in real time. The audience, lulled for nearly 40 minutes into believing they were watching a tender story of healing, suddenly understood they had been watching something else entirely. She spent years afterward rebuilding herself into a weapon. She saved methodically, sacrificed everything, and eventually hired the very assassin standing silently beside her now. The man Yi Jun had spent years believing his organization eliminated long ago, a fabricated death record buried so deep within their own files that nobody thought to question it. The accident hadn't been an accident at all. It had been a precisely engineered act of vengeance, designed not to kill Yi Jun outright, but to strip him of everything that gave his life meaning while keeping him alive to feel every excruciating moment of the loss. The wheelchair had never been an unfortunate consequence. It had been the entire point. She described, in chilling detail he would never fully shake from memory, the months Hak Cohen spent studying his routines, his drivers, his security details' predictable patterns, until executing the stage collision became less a violent act and more a precisely choreographed inevitability. They had rehearsed contingencies for nearly every outcome except the one neither of them anticipated, that the man meant only to suffer might eventually become someone she could no longer bring herself to hate without reservation. The assassin had been instructed with surgical precision, every variable of the staged accident calculated months in advance by people who understood exactly which roads Yi Jun traveled, exactly which hour his convoy would be most vulnerable, exactly how much force would shatter without killing. The 11 minutes his heart stopped on that operating table hadn't been an unforeseen complication either. It had been the closest she ever came to losing her nerve, The only moment in the entire operation when she genuinely feared the plan might collapse into something she never intended, a death rather than a slow, deliberate unraveling. She continued, methodically, mercilessly, dismantling every memory he treasured from the past 4 months. Her volunteer position at the hospital hadn't been coincidence. She had engineered her assignment to his floor through careful, patient maneuvering months in advance. Every insult she absorbed without flinching had been calculated theater. Every act of unwavering patience a performance designed to make him dependent on her presence before she ever revealed her true purpose. She had abandoned a promising surgical residency at a prestigious teaching hospital to pursue general nursing instead, a sacrifice that baffled colleagues and devastated mentors who saw extraordinary talent in her. All because general nursing offered something a surgical track never could: flexibility, proximity, the freedom to engineer exactly which patients landed under her care. 3 years of her life, restructured entirely around the architecture of this single, elaborate act of retribution. She had even anticipated CUS jealousy with disturbing precision, predicting almost exactly how his wife would respond to a perceived threat, predicting the framing, the stolen reputation, the termination that would inevitably leave her with no choice but to disappear into the very neighborhood where she knew his men would eventually find her. She had selected that particular neighborhood years in advance, a quiet, unremarkable district she'd researched extensively for its proximity to highways his men would use, its visibility from main roads, its position just far enough from organization territory to appear convincingly desperate, while remaining easy enough to locate once his patience finally broke. Every cracked step on her front porch, every second-hand piece of furniture arranged just so, had been chosen to project exactly the image of struggling poverty that would make his eventual arrival feel like rescue, rather than continuation of her design. Being discarded by the hospital hadn't been a setback. It had been the bait. Even CU, the wife who believed herself the architect of every cruelty inflicted upon KC, had unknowingly been a marionette dancing on strings she never noticed. KC had studied her for weeks before the framing ever occurred, cataloging her insecurities, her need for control, her predictable patterns of retaliation, until manipulating her into precisely the desired sequence of events became almost effortless. The frame-up, the missing footage, the very termination CU believed was her crowning achievement, had all unfolded exactly according to a design she never once suspected belonged to someone else entirely. Yijun's voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. The herbal treatments, the massages, the exercises, none of it was real. KC's composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for him to glimpse something genuine beneath the performance. "No," she said. "It never worked. I only wanted you to believe it did. I wanted you to feel hope again, so I could watch it disappear, the same way I watched everything disappear. The day I laughed," he said quietly, almost to himself, remembering the disastrous radish, the unguarded sound that had startled them both into silence. Was that real? She hesitated, and the hesitation answered the question more honestly than any words could have. "I don't know anymore. I stopped being able to tell the difference somewhere around the second month. That terrified me more than anything else in 3 years of planning. There was more, and it landed like a blade twisting slowly between his ribs. Certain medications she administered during their time together hadn't been the treatments he believed them to be. Not enough to kill him outright, never enough to draw suspicion, but enough to ensure the fragile recovery he'd been building never fully took hold, enough to guarantee his suffering stretched on indefinitely. She explained the chemistry of it with the detached precision of someone reciting a recipe rather than confessing a crime. A careful substitution here, a delayed dosage there, compounds chosen specifically because they mimic the natural plateaus and setbacks any recovering patient might experience, ensuring no physician would ever suspect deliberate sabotage. She had researched pharmacology for nearly a year before ever stepping foot inside that hospital, determined that whatever she did to him would leave no trace a toxicology report could ever identify. I needed you to feel it, she said, her voice cracking despite its flatness. Not understand it. Feel it. The way my sister felt it, watching the only family she had left dragged out of a building that didn't even bother remembering her husband's name. Every tender moment Yi-jun had treasured over the previous 4 months reassembled itself in his memory as something monstrous, a slow, deliberate cruelty disguised so completely as compassion that he had fallen in love with the very mechanism of his own destruction. If this story has gripped you the way I think it has, take 30 seconds right now and comment the city you're watching from. Hit that subscribe button and stick around because what happens in the next few minutes is the kind of ending people are still going to be talking about tomorrow. So none of it was real, Yi-jun finally said, his voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator behind them, an absurdly mundane sound for a moment that felt like the end of the world. Tell me, was any of it real? Casey's eyes filled, and for the first time since this confrontation began, her hands trembled. No, she said. I loved you, he said simply, the confession costing him more than anything else he'd surrendered in this story so far. I don't care, she answered, though her voice broke completely on the final word, and the tears sliding down her face told a truth her sentence refused to admit. She cared. She cared more than she had allowed herself to acknowledge in years of careful, methodical planning. But caring had never been part of the design, and she refused, even now, to let it derail what she had sacrificed everything to accomplish. Then why are you crying? He asked, and the question hung between them, unanswerable, devastating in its simplicity. She didn't respond. She couldn't. 3 years of meticulous preparation had never once accounted for the possibility that somewhere between the lies and the poisoned medicine and the calculated tenderness, something real might have grown anyway, stubborn and unwanted, refusing every instruction she gave it to die. Yi-jun understood, watching her fracture in front of him, that her hatred had never extinguished, only postponed itself. She still wanted him to pay for what his family's empire had taken from her. Then finish it, he said quietly. Whatever you came here to do, finish it. I'm tired of being the only person in this story who doesn't know how it ends. She shook her head slowly, tears streaking down a face that had spent 4 months performing serenity she clearly no longer felt. I don't know how to finish it anymore. I planned every single piece of this for 3 years. I never once planned for the part where I'd actually... Her voice fractured before she could complete the sentence. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and produced a handgun, the only weapon he carried these days, mostly out of habit rather than necessity. He extended it toward her, grip first, his hand barely steady. If killing me ends your pain, he said, then do it. He meant it. There was no performance in the offer, no manipulation disguised as sacrifice. 3 years of her carefully constructed plan had finally collided with a man who genuinely no longer feared the ending she designed for him, who had already lost a body that obeyed him, a family that valued him, and now, apparently, a love that had never been real to begin with. What remained left to lose felt, in that moment, almost negligible. The silence that followed stretched longer than any silence in this entire story, longer than the 11 minutes his heart had stopped on that operating table months earlier. AfroKorean stood motionless near the doorway, watching, waiting, his expression betraying nothing of what he hoped would happen next. Casey's hand closed around a grip. She raised it. Her arm trembled violently, the barrel wavering between his chest and the floor as 4 months of carefully constructed hatred collided head-on with something she had never planned for, something that refused to be calculated or controlled. The gun slipped from her fingers and clattered against the floorboards. She collapsed to her knees, sobbing in a way that finally, completely, abandoned every ounce of composure she had maintained throughout this entire elaborate revenge. Yi-jun reached down, pulled her against him despite the awkward angle of his still-healing legs, and held her while they both wept, neither one victorious, neither one defeated, both of them simply ruined by everything that had happened between them. AfroKorean watched this unfold from the doorway, without a single word of protest. Slowly, he reached into his pocket, removed the engagement ring Casey had worn as part of their cover, and set it gently on the kitchen counter beside her abandoned teacup. He had agreed to this elaborate deception 3 years earlier for reasons of his own, a debt owed to her brother that predated even her sister's death, a quiet loyalty forged in circumstances neither of them ever discussed openly. Watching her collapse in another man's arms wasn't the betrayal it might have appeared to an outsider. It was, in its own complicated way, a release he had quietly hoped for without ever admitting it, even to himself. Then he turned and walked out the front door without a backward glance, without a goodbye, leaving behind a partnership built entirely around vengeance, now dissolving into something neither of them had the language to describe. Hours later, after Casey had cried herself into an exhausted, hollow silence, after Yijun had carried her to the small couch in her living room and sat beside her in wordless solidarity, neither of them noticed Hakwon had never actually left the city. He had simply gone somewhere else entirely. In his jacket pocket, a small digital recorder had captured every single word of Casey's confession, every detail of the assassination contract, every admission of the slow poisoning, the staged accident, the years of meticulous planning that had finally, catastrophically unraveled in that cramped kitchen. He walked directly into the heavily guarded headquarters of the Soul Syndicate, past security who recognized him as the fiancé, connected to the woman who had recently consumed so much of their boss's attention, and requested an audience with the one person whose authority superseded even Dukwon's. Yijun, the matriarch whose influence ran quieter and deeper than anyone in the organization openly acknowledged, agreed to see him. He placed the recorder on the table between them, without a single word of explanation, and pressed play. The room, filled with senior generals and lieutenants who had served this family for decades, went utterly silent as Casey's voice filled the space, confession after confession spilling out in the same flat, devastating tone she had used in her kitchen only hours earlier. Several of the older men exchanged glances heavy with disbelief. Nobody in that room had ever imagined the organization's untouchable air could be undone so completely, so quietly, by a woman none of them had bothered to investigate. Yijun's expression didn't change throughout the entire recording. When it finally ended, she folded her hands carefully in her lap and spoke in a voice colder than anything her son had ever directed at his nurses during the darkest weeks of his recovery. She tried to kill my son. The generals rose from their seats in unison. Weapons clicked into readiness throughout the room. Orders began spreading through the organization's network within minutes. Quiet, efficient, merciless instructions traveling through channels that had ended countless lives long before tonight. Dong stood near the back of the room throughout the entire recording, watching his mother's face for some flicker of hesitation that never arrived. He thought, unexpectedly, of the brother he had visited twice in that hospital room. The brother who refused to look at him, the brother who had finally, after everything, found something resembling peace. Dong understood, more clearly than anyone else in that room, exactly what these orders would cost his brother. And for the first time since accepting his promotion, he wondered whether the Empire was worth what it demanded of the people who loved it. Find her. Across the city, completely unaware that the Empire he had spent his entire life commanding had just declared war on the woman sleeping exhausted in his arms. Yijun held Casey a little tighter, finally beginning to understand the terrifying shape of the choice closing in around him. Protect the woman who had broken through every wall he'd built around himself, and betray the only family he had left. Or protect his family's name, the empire his ancestors built, the loyalty owed to blood, and lose the only person who had ever made him feel like more than a title. There was a third option too, one he hadn't yet allowed himself to fully consider. The possibility that protecting her might require becoming something entirely different from the man who had spent his entire life enforcing his family's will across the city. He thought of his father's 8 words in that hospital room, of the wheelchair, of the 11 minutes his heart had stopped beating, of every loving lie Casey had told him with hands that had also, somewhere along the way, learned to mean it. Outside her window, the city he had once commanded without question continued its indifferent glow, towers of light stretching toward a sky neither of them could see clearly through the curtains. Somewhere in that skyline, men were already moving, vehicles already pulling onto streets, an entire machinery of vengeance setting itself into motion against a woman who had spent 3 years engineering her own destruction long before tonight ever arrived. Somewhere across Seoul, his phone began ringing. He didn't answer it yet. He just held her, knowing that whatever he chose in the coming hours would cost him something he could never get back. If this story had you holding your breath, comment part 2. Right now, if you want to know what Yi Jun decides, because this is far from over, and the next chapter is going to be even more intense than everything you just witnessed. Like this video, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in part 2.